My father had just died. My sister Harper was glowing at his funeral. Then the lawyer read the will, everything goes to Harper. My mother just said, don't cause trouble. I left with nothing. Except one hard drive, one secret that could burn everything to the ground. Think this is just another family story? Think again. Subscribe now so you won't miss our next explosive episode. Elena shifted her weight on the uneven stone step, her toes numb in the cheap black flats she'd pulled from the back of her closet. The hem of her dress was damp, clinging to her calves. She hadn't been offered a car, hadn't been told the service would start early. She found out from a forwarded email sent by one of the company's assistants. It hadn't even included her name. Inside the chapel smelled of lilies and varnished wood, too clean and too bright for a day that felt like it should be swallowed by shadows. The casket sat center stage, framed by two towering arrangements of white roses. Her father's name was etched into the brass plate Douglas H. Prescott. Beneath it, the words, "Beloved husband, father visionary." Elena hadn't seen her father's body. They'd cremated him before she arrived. She kept to the back of the room, standing between two empty pews, her presence half hidden by a marble column and an oversized fern. The guests filed in, murmuring heads dipped in reverence. Several corporate board members whispered among themselves. A state senator took a seat in the second row. Photographers from the press snapped a few discreet shots before being ushered outside. And Harper glided through it all, touching shoulders, offering soft reassurances, crying precisely once, just enough to draw sympathy, then dabbing her eye with a lace-trimmed handkerchief as if to signal she was composed again. Elena felt invisible, like the walls had swallowed her whole. She remembered a time when it hadn't been like this. When she was 9 and had broken her arm climbing the tree in the backyard, her father had carried her in his arms, whispering, "You're my little soldier." That was before Harper grew into her beauty, before their mother decided which daughter was more presentable, before family dinners turned into performance reviews, before Elena learned to disappear without ever leaving the room. "Don't stand there like a ghost!" a sharp voice hissed beside her. Elena turned. Her mother stood a few feet away, dressed in a sleek black sheath dress, a diamond brooch glinting on her collar. Her lipstick was perfect, her tone colder than the rain outside. "I wasn't trying to—" Her mother cut her off with a glance. "Today is about Harper. Please don't make a scene." Elena blinked. "It's his funeral." Her mother's jaw tightened. "Exactly. He worked his whole life to build something. This company, this legacy, it's Harper's now. You being here doesn't change that." There it was, the thing no one had the decency to veil. Elena swallowed the bitterness climbing her throat. "I just came to say goodbye." Well, her mother said, adjusting the pearl strand around her neck, "Do it quietly." The organ began to play, signaling the start of the service. People rose in unison. Harper took her place at the podium with a grace that bordered on theatrical. She began her eulogy with a story about their father teaching her how to sail on the lake house dock, how he'd once said she was destined to lead. No mention of Elena, not a single word. Elena sank into the corner pew as Harper spoke about legacy and responsibility, about how the Prescott family name stood for innovation and discipline. Guests nodded, some dabbing at their eyes, others watching her with admiration. She felt herself untethering from the moment, like her body was present, but her spirit had slipped sideways. Her father was dead. The man who once taught her how to tie a fishing knot with trembling hands after a long surgery shift. The man who left early to attend Harper's debate but forgot Elena's piano recital. The man who had told her quietly after one brutal Thanksgiving, "You're stronger than you look. Just keep your head down." Now he was gone. And somehow in his absence, Harper had inherited everything, including the narrative. When the service ended, people milled around outside beneath a row of black umbrellas, murmuring about the legacy he left behind. A Titan one said, "Prescott Industries will thrive under Harper." No one looked at Elena. No one remembered she had his eyes. She stood alone at the edge of the parking lot, watching as Harper posed briefly with her hand on the urn for a photo requested by one of the shareholders. Elena wanted to scream or vanish. She turned toward the path leading down the side of the chapel. A narrow gravel trail that led to the private garden where her father used to take meetings in the spring, hidden among the roses. She walked there now, the rain tapering off to a cold drizzle soaking into the shoulders of her coat. The garden was empty, but the bench was still there. She sat. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe. There were no flowers for her, no hands reaching for her shoulders, no whispered words of comfort, just wet air, gray sky, and the hum of wind cutting through the hedges. She was the second daughter, The one no one saw coming. The one who remembered everything. The reading of the will was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp in the Prescott family library, an opulent room of mahogany shelves, leaded glass windows, and the kind of silence that pressed in from all sides like judgment. A fire crackled in the hearth too warm for late spring, and it only made Elena feel more out of place in her wrinkled coat and damp flats. Harper arrived 5 minutes early, of course. In a structured black dress, pearls at her throat, and a leather-bound notebook clutched under one arm, she looked like she was heading into a board meeting, not the settling of her father's estate. Their mother trailed in shortly after, speaking in hushed tones with one of the family attorneys. She didn't glance Elena's way. Elena sat stiffly on the edge of an upholstered chair near the back wall, her palms damp, heart pounding in a rhythm she couldn't slow. She hadn't slept. Not since the funeral. Not since she'd watched Harper kiss the urn and thank the crowd like they were guests at a gala. A man in a dark gray suit cleared his throat. "Let's begin," he said, flipping open a thick manila folder with precise movements. His name was Douglas Keene, an estate lawyer who had worked for her father for over a decade, though Elena had only met him once or twice in passing. He didn't smile, didn't soften the edges of his expression. His role was to execute, not explain. "We're here to execute the last will and testament of Mr. Douglas H. Prescott," he began. As per the version filed and notarized 6 months prior to his passing, the following allocations will be announced. Elena leaned forward, clutching the sides of the chair, willing herself to breathe. She wasn't expecting riches. She wasn't even expecting equity. But something, a letter, a small share of the company, maybe the cottage they'd spent summers in when she was 12, would mean her father hadn't erased her entirely. Keene continued, his voice clipped and formal. "To Harper Ann Prescott, my eldest daughter, I bequeath full ownership and executive authority over Prescott Industries, including all voting shares, assets, and intellectual property, effective immediately." Elena blinked. "To Harper Ann Prescott. I also leave the Prescott estate all attached land holdings, vehicles, and liquid accounts with the exception of designated trust transfers." The words fell like stones. Keene turned a page. "To Elena Margaret Prescott." A pause. Elena's fingers curled into fists on her lap. The silence roared in her ears. "I leave my heartfelt appreciation." She went still. "That's it?" she asked, her voice a whisper raw. Keene glanced up, unreadable. "That is the extent of Mr. Prescott's instructions regarding your portion of the estate." Harper turned in her chair, slow and deliberate, like a queen granting an audience. "Elena," she said smoothly, "you were always so idealistic. But even you have to admit this isn't a surprise." Elena stared at her, unable to find words. Harper's lips curled in that familiar, condescending smile. Dad made his choice. He chose the daughter who didn't run away, who didn't disappoint him, who didn't flinch when things got hard. "I didn't flinch," Elena said through clenched teeth. Harper arched a brow. "Didn't you?" Their mother spoke up, her voice cool and clipped. "This isn't the time for theatrics." Elena stood abruptly. "He wouldn't do this." But no one responded. She turned to Keene. "You're sure this is his last will? There wasn't a revision, an older version." "I'm only authorized to read the most recent notarized will," he replied evenly. Elena's breath came shallow and fast. "Can I see it?" "No," her mother cut in. "It's not your document to question." Harper rose, gathering her things. "Let's not drag this out, shall we? You always hated goodbyes." Elena's body was trembling now. She wasn't sure if it was rage or disbelief, or the sheer humiliation of being erased in a room where her blood should have meant something. "This house, the company, he built all of it? And I was by his side for every decision," Harper interrupted smoothly. "While you were off chasing passion projects and writing poetry no one read." A short laugh, cold, mean. "You were never really built for this world, Elena." Elena stared at her sister. For a brief moment, she saw the face of the child she used to play dress-up with, the girl who once cried when they got lost in a mall together. But that version of Harper had been buried long ago, replaced by this polished, ruthless avatar. Keene cleared his throat again. "Unless there are additional concerns, I'll proceed with filing the probate orders and notifying the trust managers." "There is one concern," Harper said, casually glancing toward the hall. "She doesn't live here anymore." Elena turned sharply. "What?" "You're no longer a legal resident of the Prescott estate," Harper said. "And I'm the legal property holder. That makes you a trespasser." "You can't be serious," Elena whispered. "Actually, I am," Harper said. "You have 1 hour to pack your things. I've already asked the staff to bring your belongings to the front. You'll find them in the blue guest room." Elena's chest burned. That's not your call. It is now, Harper snapped. And if you refuse, I will involve security. No one stood up for her. No one even looked surprised. The lawyer didn't flinch. Their mother straightened her gloves and stepped out of the room like nothing had happened. Elena walked up the stairs in a haze, her legs moving on memory. The blue guest room used to be her childhood bedroom before Harper decided it clashed with her new wallpaper and demanded Elena be moved. Nothing in it was hers anymore, except a single suitcase on the bed already zipped. A housekeeper stood in the corner, awkwardly eyes downcast. Elena ignored her. She scanned the room one last time, then moved to the closet. A small, battered shoebox sat tucked behind a row of unused linens. Inside it was an external hard drive wrapped in a white towel. She didn't remember packing it, but she remembered her father giving it to her once years ago when he said, "This is where I keep the things that matter, just in case." She clutched it like it was the last solid thing in the world. Downstairs, the car was already waiting. The driver avoided her gaze as he opened the door. Harper watched from the front step, arms crossed, face blank. As the car pulled away, Elena didn't look back at the estate. She looked down at the hard drive in her lap, and for the first time that day, she let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, it still held a piece of the truth. The room was cold, barely lit by a single floor lamp flickering in the corner. Paint peeled from the ceiling, and the walls smelled faintly of mold and old cigarettes. Elena hadn't planned to stay here long. It was just a temporary rental she found online in a panic after being expelled from the only home she had ever known. The suitcase sat unopened in the middle of the floor. She hadn't unpacked. She hadn't slept either. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the thin carpet, a chipped coffee table before her laptop, humming quietly beside an external hard drive, black scratched, wrapped in the same towel her father used to keep on his desk for cleaning glasses. She didn't know why she had grabbed it. Instinct, maybe, or desperation. But now, holding it, fingers hovering over the trackpad, something inside her whispered, "This is where it starts." She plugged it in. The screen blinked. Inside were 6 folders. One named simply Backups, another titled Harper, Legal. Her stomach twisted at the sight of it. She opened it. There were PDFs, email logs, even raw audio files, everything neatly dated. Her father's old sense of order hadn't abandoned him even as his body had. Her pulse quickened. She clicked open one of the emails dated 3 months before his death. It was from Harper. Subject line, final paperwork. The body was short to the point. "He's fading faster than expected. I'll have the notary on standby Wednesday. Make sure he signs while he still recognizes my name." Elena reread it. Twice. She sat back, heart pounding in her ears. She scrolled further. Another email this time from someone named S. Linton, a name she didn't recognize. The message was laced in corporate phrasing, but the meaning was unmistakable. As discussed, verbal consent will suffice under the emergency provisions as long as the document bears a date. The signature itself is more symbolic at this point. Proceed carefully. Symbolic. Her father's signature. Elena stared at the screen, every inch of her body tightening. Something was deeply wrong. She opened the audio file marked March 14 Office Rect MP3. Static filled her headphones at first. Then the low hum of air conditioning, then voices. Her father's voice, faint, raspy. "Don't understand, this one's different, Harper." And Harper, calm, coaxing. "Dad, we've been over this. You said you trusted me. All you need to do is sign okay. The paperwork's ready, just a signature and you can go rest." No, I want, Elena should." A pause. Then Harper again, this time harder. "Elena doesn't want any of this. She told me she was done with the family. Remember?" Silence. Then the unmistakable scrape of pen on paper. Elena's hand shot to her mouth. She hit pause. It was her father, signing something he didn't understand. Signing something under pressure. In confusion. With Harper pushing him. Tears welled at the corners of her eyes, not because she was sad, but because something inside her had just shifted. Like a lever being pulled, gears grinding into motion. For days she'd blamed herself. Thought maybe she had misunderstood, or maybe her father really had chosen Harper because he believed she was the stronger one. But now she knew. This wasn't about favoritism. This was manipulation. Fraud. She opened more emails, quickly scanning for threads. There were dozens. Between Harper and this S. Linton. Between Harper and someone in HR at Prescott Industries. Phrases like strategic succession contingency planning and clean asset transfer peppered every line. One thread stopped her cold. Once the documents are signed and dated, there's no going back. As long as Elena isn't on the title, she has no legal standing. If she protests, we default to the mental instability clause from '08. You still have that file. Mental instability clause. Elena slammed the laptop shut. Her mind raced. She knew exactly what they were talking about the therapy sessions. The counseling she'd gone through in college after a bad breakup left her spiraling for months. Her father had paid for it quietly, even told her it was okay to fall apart sometimes. It doesn't make you weak, he'd said. But Harper had kept that file. She wasn't just cutting Elena out. She was laying the groundwork to destroy her if she ever came back. Elena stood up, pacing the room. Her thoughts weren't jumbled, they were crystalline, razor sharp. For the first time in days, her grief wasn't drowning her. It was galvanizing her. She looked around the room. The cracked mirror, the flickering lamp, her own reflection staring back, drawn and sleep-deprived but not broken. They thought they could erase her with paper and ink, with carefully worded lies, with signatures written under duress and silence weaponized into inheritance. No, not this time. Not this Elena. She sat back down, opened the laptop again, and began transferring the files, every email, every audio log, every digital breadcrumb onto a second drive. She renamed the folder Truth. This wasn't going to be a fight in courtrooms. This wasn't going to be about revenge, at least not in the way Harper might expect. Elena would play the long game. She would uncover every brick of the empire Harper was building on top of her father's half-conscious hand. And she'd do it on her terms. Quiet. Meticulous. Undeniable. As the hard drive finished copying, she opened a blank text document and began writing. A timeline. A trail. A story. Not the one Harper had written into legal paperwork, but the real one. The one that started with a whisper from a dying man who still remembered his second daughter's name. And this time she would make damn sure no one ever forgot it again. The screen glowed pale blue in the dark. Elena hadn't slept. Again. The clock on her nightstand read 3:17 a.m., but time had stopped making sense hours ago. Her laptop buzzed low with the weight of everything she'd just seen: forged power shifts, strategic gaslighting, the silent erasure of her name from everything her father had once built. The data sat there blinking in folders: Harper, legal signed audio transfer logs, all dated, all damning. And yet none of it mattered if she couldn't prove it. Not in the eyes of a boardroom full of old men in custom suits. Not in court. Not in the real world where paper trails and polished PR statements rewrote history every day. She needed someone who could validate the files not emotionally but technically. Someone who could take the digital dust and reassemble it into a weapon. One they couldn't ignore. She stared at her phone for a long time before pressing the contact. Ryan Keller. They hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years. The last time was over coffee in Midtown after he quit his job at the firm where they'd both interned. He'd said something about moving into private cybersecurity, less politics, more precision. She remembered laughing, telling him he sounded like he was about to start a cult. She didn't laugh now. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She tapped. It rang twice. Then Elena. His voice hadn't changed, still cautious, still calculating. "Hey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end. "What kind?" "The kind that gets people disbarred." Another pause. Then a shift in tone, curious, sharp. "Talk." Within an hour, they were on a secure call. She'd encrypted and uploaded a package of the most crucial files to a drive he could access. As he opened them, she listened to the silence on the line. Watched the way it stretched heavy and slow as he scrolled. After 15 minutes, he exhaled. "Jesus Christ, Elena, you weren't kidding. I need to know what's real," she said. "Legally, digitally, time-stamped." He nodded through the screen. "The email headers are clean. Unaltered metadata, original, send paths, valid encryption signatures." Harper didn't even bother to spoof internal servers. Lazy, arrogant. And the audio, he leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "That recording you sent, it's not only real, it's location tagged. Your father's office. Internal mic source, likely his old backup surveillance system. If she had that running and still coerced him, it's not just unethical. It's prosecutable." Elena's hands gripped the edges of the laptop. Would it hold up in court? With the right forensic witness? Absolutely. She stared at the files again, this time with a growing sense of clarity. What she had wasn't just evidence, it was a blade waiting to be sharpened. "I don't want to file a suit," she said. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "You just said you want justice." "I do. But not the kind that drags me into a courtroom where Harper spins a sob story and Mom cries into a silk handkerchief on the front page of the Times." "Then what do you want?" "I want them to drown in the truth," she said, her voice quiet but cold. I want the empire Harper thinks she's inherited to crumble beneath her feet before she can realize what's happening. Not because I'm fighting her in front of cameras, but because the walls cave in from the inside. Ryan didn't speak for a moment. Then you're scarier than I remember. Good, Elena said. Now help me burn it down. They spent the next 2 hours scrubbing the metadata, verifying document timestamps tracing IP addresses. By dawn, Ryan had stitched together a clear digital chain, Harper's emails to a private lawyer, strategizing succession fraud, the rushed notary requests, the coercion clips spliced and transcribed. Bundle it all into a neutral format, she told him. PDF with embedded source links. No names, no sender, just facts. You're sending this anonymously, Ryan asked. Yes. To who? The people who trusted my father to lead them, the board, and someone who still believes in journalism. By 9:00 a.m., Elena had compiled 2 versions of the evidence package. One stripped of identifying markers was formatted for board review, clean corporate clinical. It included a timeline of events, an overview of potential violations of company ethics policies, and a call to initiate an independent audit. She titled it simply, Concerns Regarding the Legitimacy of Succession at Prescott Industries. The second was curated with more narrative impact. Quotes pulled directly from Harper's emails, screenshots of calendar invites overlapping with the day their father signed the forged will, the clipped audio of Harper saying, "All you need to do is sign OK," as her father mumbled through confusion. This one was going to a journalist named Isabel Thorne, an investigative reporter at the Ledger known for financial exposés that left CEOs shaking behind boardroom doors. Elena had followed her work for years, trusted her, or at least trusted her voice. She created a burner email, attached the file, and typed only one sentence. Truth doesn't need a name, just a platform. She hit send. Then she leaned back in the stiff motel chair, staring at the cracked ceiling above her like it might hold some hidden message. Ryan texted a few minutes later. It's done. Want to grab breakfast? She typed back, not yet. The storm hasn't landed. And that was the truth. She didn't need anyone to know she was behind it. Not yet. Not until Harper's world began to implode. Not until the very men who toasted her as the rightful heir started whispering behind closed doors. Elena didn't want a spotlight. She wanted consequence. Let Harper feel what it's like to be questioned. Let their mother squirm beneath the weight of secrets she helped enable. Let the world see what happens when the second daughter decides she's no longer invisible. And if they asked who did it, she hoped they'd never find out. Because that she thought would be the only kind of justice that mattered, one where the truth stood taller than any name, where silence for once was power. The breaking point didn't come with an explosion. It arrived in whispers. At 7:42 a.m., the Prescott Industries internal server pinged an all-hands alert. An emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9:00 a.m., with immediate governance concern listed in the subject line. By 8:15, the hallways on the 34th floor were full of uneasy chatter and clutched coffee cups. No one had specifics, but everyone felt it something had fractured. Inside the boardroom, 12 men and women gathered around the massive mahogany table that still bore Douglas Prescott's nameplate untouched since his passing. The air smelled of varnish and tension. At the head sat Harper, her jaw-tight blazer immaculate, but her fingers trembled ever so slightly when she reached for her water glass. Chairman Aldridge, a gray-haired man with a face carved in stone and a reputation for patience, placed a slim folder in front of him and spoke first. "This document was delivered to my office anonymously last night," he said. "It contains records suggesting a deliberate manipulation of succession documentation and coercion of a mentally impaired party." The room went still. Harper's voice came fast, sharp. "That's absurd!" Aldridge didn't blink. "Absurd or not, the contents demand investigation. The emails are time-stamped. The audio file appears to capture a conversation between you and your father dated 3 days before his signature was notarized." "I don't even know where that came from," Harper said, forcing a laugh. "Anyone could have faked it." Board member Ellison, a woman known for dissecting acquisitions like autopsies, leaned forward. "The metadata has been verified by a third-party forensics team. It's authentic. This wasn't tampered with." Harper's throat tightened. Aldridge continued. "We also found correspondence between you and S. Linton, an unregistered legal advisor. Would you like to explain the context?" Harper opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes darted across the room, but no one offered her a lifeline. "Do you deny instructing this individual to prepare a will revision under your father's declining mental state?" I was trying to ensure continuity," she stammered. "The company needed clear leadership. My father, he wasn't well. He didn't know who to trust." And you decided that person was you, Ellison said coolly. No, Harper's voice cracked. I mean, yes, but not like this. He told me he said, Aldridge raised a hand. Harper, stop. The room fell into a hush again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was conclusive. They had heard enough. Across town, Elena sat at a cafe with a chipped ceramic mug between her palms, watching the story unfold in real time on her phone screen. The Ledger had dropped the piece at exactly 900 a.m., just as the boardroom doors had closed behind Harper. The headline was blunt. Heir or architect allegations of fraud, rock Prescott empire. She sipped slowly, letting the words soak into her like coffee into cold soil. The article was a scalpel, not a hammer, surgical and damning. It didn't accuse, but it revealed. Excerpts from Harper's emails, a redacted transcript of the recording, a brief history of the Prescott estate and its rise through carefully constructed public image, and a single devastating quote from an unnamed source. She acted like the legacy was hers before he even passed. Elena didn't smile. She didn't need to. The comments section had already erupted. Some defended Harper clinging to her polished persona. Others began connecting dots they'd ignored for years. Shady boardroom reshuffles, sudden promotions, the vanishing of her father's long-trusted CFO last spring. Twitter was worse, or better, depending on how you looked at it. Prescott hair was trending by noon. Harper's face, flawless, frozen in the confident smirk she'd worn for a recent press conference, circulated with captions like, from boardroom to backroom deals and daddy's girl or corporate con. At 1:30 p.m., a Prescott PR rep released a vague statement citing a coordinated misinformation campaign targeting female leadership. But by then, it was too late. The internet didn't care about official language. Screenshots lived longer than spin. Elena closed her laptop and walked to the park nearby phone, buzzing nonstop in her jacket pocket. Ryan had texted her, "Holy shut. You've started a war." No, not a war. A reckoning. By the time Harper emerged from the building surrounded by security hair, pulled back too tight, eyes too wide, she was no longer the image of confidence. She was the image of exposure. Her phone vibrated in her hand constantly, but she didn't answer. Paparazzi stood across the street, restrained only by company guards. Someone from the Ledger called out to her, "Ms. Prescott, do you deny the recording?" She didn't answer. She just kept walking. Inside her office, the assistant who had once announced her arrival like royalty now avoided her gaze. Later that night, another email leaked. Harper's resignation draft, partial unsubmitted, somehow found its way online. Elena, meanwhile, sat on the edge of her motel bed, back straight, phone quiet now. She wasn't celebrating. She was watching, carefully, letting the weight of it settle, not like victory, but like justice. The kind that arrives late, silent, and unrelenting. A kind Harper had never seen coming. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and burnt coffee. Elena sat on the edge of the motel bed, the dim light from the cracked bathroom door casting a long shadow across the carpet. Her phone was dark now, face down. The world outside buzzed with Harper's unraveling, but inside was quiet. And in that stillness, memory slipped in. It started with a sound. The whisper of shoes on hardwood echoing off high ceilings. She was 6, maybe 7, sitting on the floor of the foyer with her coloring book, trying to stay invisible as their mother prepared Harper for another piano recital. Harper was in her white dress, with the velvet sash hair in perfect curls. Elena's dress was a hand-me-down. Too short, itched at the seams. "Can I come too?" Elena had asked, voice small. Their mother hadn't even looked at her. "Not this time, darling. Don't distract your sister." It wasn't a cruel statement. Not exactly, just dismissive. Like swatting at dust. That was the rhythm of Elena's childhood. Harper got the spotlight. Elena got the corners. Birthdays were joint, but Harper always got to choose the cake. Elena wanted chocolate. Harper demanded lemon chiffon. They got lemon. Always lemon. At 10, Elena wrote her first story, a tale about a girl who could hear the ocean in her bones. She showed it to her father after dinner, nervous, hopeful. He read it quickly, then handed it back without meeting her eyes. "That's nice, kiddo," he said, "but make sure you're not wasting time. Harper has that spelling bee coming up. Maybe help her practice instead." She nodded, said okay. But she didn't write again for months. Years later, at 17, she applied to the Caraway Fellowship, a national scholarship for young writers. Only 5 people were chosen each year. She poured herself into the application, wrote a personal essay so raw her hands shook when she sealed the envelope. She got in. It was the first time anyone had picked her. Not Harper, not their parents. her. She was still holding the letter in her hand when Harper found her on the back porch, sun dipping low behind the magnolia trees. "What's that?" Harper asked, eyeing the envelope. Elena hesitated, then held it out. "I got the fellowship." Harper blinked. "For writing?" "Yeah." A pause. Harper's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Wow, that's unexpected." Later that week, Elena logged into her laptop to finalize a digital portfolio submission and found several of her drafts corrupted, gone. The only backup she had was on a flash drive that vanished from her desk the next day. She missed the submission deadline. The committee revoked her place. She told her parents the truth, well, half of it. That she'd lost the files, that she'd been careless. They barely looked up from their wine. "You'll bounce back," her father said. "Besides, writing's just a hobby. It's not a real future." Harper never mentioned it, never confessed. But Elena knew. There had been fingerprints on the USB drawer, and that same week, Harper's college application essay was published in a local magazine with a line that felt painfully familiar. She heard the ocean in her bones. Elena didn't fight it. She swallowed it, like always. And then there was the staircase. It was raining. Elena had been carrying a stack of boxes for a school fundraiser, shoes slick on the marble. Harper came around the corner too fast, shoulders squared, eyes locked ahead, like Elena wasn't even there. They collided. Elena slipped. The fall was short but brutal. Her elbow hit first, then her ribs. She laid there for a moment, wind knocked from her lungs. Harper didn't help her up. She didn't say sorry. She stepped over her. Their father came running after the sound. For once, he didn't scold Elena, didn't ask what she'd done wrong. He knelt, checked her breathing, brushed the wet hair from her face. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured. She didn't respond. He helped her sit, then placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not like Harper," he said softly. "She's brilliant. She shines. But you endure." He didn't say it as a compliment, not really. But she clung to it. For years. Now, sitting in the motel room, that moment echoed louder than ever. Not because it had comforted her, but because it had been the only one. One time. One small window of truth in a house full of silence. She stared at her reflection in the motel mirror. Harper hadn't just taken opportunities. She'd rewritten Elena's past in real time, erased her victories, painted herself into every frame where Elena might have stood alone. And Elena had let her, because somewhere deep down she believed maybe she wasn't enough. Maybe she was only meant to survive. But not anymore. The stories Harper had stolen the spotlight, she had seized the father she had manipulated, none of it was hers now. The world was watching. The truth had begun to ripple. Elena stood cross to her laptop and opened a new document. At the top, she typed a single sentence. "This is not a story about revenge. It's a story about reclamation." She stared at it, and finally, she began to write. The war didn't end when the truth came out, it escalated. On a Wednesday morning, steeped in gray, Elena woke to the thud of an envelope slid under her motel door. No knock, no voice, just that deliberate, sterile sound of consequence. She stared at it for a full 30 seconds before picking it up. It was heavier than she expected, too many pages for anything good. She peeled the flap open and found the header first. Prescott Legal Group, Notice of Civil Action. She sat down, read slowly, methodically. Her heartbeat wasn't racing, not yet. The words were precise, cold. Defendant Elena Margaret Prescott is hereby named in a defamation suit and psychological competency review alleging the unauthorized release of proprietary internal documents, falsified digital evidence, and malicious slander with intent to damage corporate and personal reputation. And then the line that hollowed her chest. Included in the plaintiff's filing are medical records documenting the defendant's previous diagnosis and treatment for major depressive disorder following an emotional episode that rendered her temporarily unfit for academic performance. She closed the file. She didn't need to read more. Harper had gone nuclear. Elena stood slowly crossed to the motel sink, splashed water on her face. The reflection that stared back looked steady, too steady. A quiet woman in an oversized hoodie and faded jeans. No makeup, no armor, just skin and nerves and memory. She whispered, "So this is the game you're playing." The email came next, sent out at 9:07 a.m. to every major financial news outlet. Prescott responds. Former family member behind vicious smear campaign. Harper's statement was as rehearsed as it was venomous. She spoke of grief, of betrayal, of a deeply troubled, estranged relative with a documented history of psychological instability. She painted herself as the guardian of her father's legacy, protecting his company from a wave of falsehoods designed to destabilize years of work. Then came the kicker, a scanned letter from a psychiatric evaluation dated 2014, signed by a university therapist Elena barely remembered. The diagnosis was real. The sessions had been real. Back then, Elena had been 22, heartbroken, lost, and clinging to the edge of a breakdown she didn't know how to name. Now Harper was using that pain as a weapon. By noon, blogs picked it up. The Heir with a Past. Was Prescott's whistleblower unwell one, even embedded the old yearbook photo of Elena Glass's no-makeup blank stare under a headline reading The Shadow Sister Steps Forward. They dissected her life like it belonged to them. Reddit threads speculated about her mental state. Twitter swarmed with opinions from strangers who had never met her but suddenly had something to say. Maybe she's telling the truth, someone wrote, but if she's unstable, how do we know what to believe? By 3:00 p.m., a process server handed her an official court summons. She was now legally listed as a defendant in a case claiming intentional defamation, digital forgery, and reputational sabotage. The irony burned in her throat like bile. Harper, who had buried their father's will in paperwork and deception, now stood before the world as the wronged party. And Elena, the daughter who had done nothing but pull back the curtain, was being cast as the villain. But the worst part wasn't the lawsuit. It was the past clawing back to life. She hadn't thought about that year in so long. The panic attacks in her dorm room, the nights spent curled under a desk in the dark, too ashamed to call home, too afraid to ask for help. Her father had covered the therapy bills without ever asking questions. And she'd told herself that meant he understood. But Harper had kept the receipts. She remembered now. That cold afternoon when Harper had found the pill bottle in her drawer. The way she held it up like a trophy. You really are fragile, aren't you? Elena had begged her not to tell their parents. Harper never did. Now she knew why. Because Harper had been saving it. Saving every crack in Elena's armor, every bad day, every flaw for this exact moment. For when she needed to make her sister disappear all over again. Elena sat on the floor back against the wall, letting the chaos swirl outside. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd already cried for this version of herself. The one who once thought survival was something to be ashamed of. Now Harper wanted to use that survival against her. But Elena knew something Harper didn't. Pain had taught her how to breathe underwater. And now she was learning how to swim through fire. She reached for her phone and called Ryan. She filed a countersuit, she said calmly. I saw, he said. She's trying to shift the narrative. Frame you as unstable. Plant doubt. It's working. He was quiet for a beat. Then, what do you want to do? Elena didn't hesitate. I want to remind her what real instability looks like. She stood, opened her laptop, and began pulling together everything she hadn't sent the first time, raw files, off-the-record statements from former staff calendar overlaps, notary logs that proved coercion by date and time. This time it wouldn't be anonymous. This time she would sign her name, because they'd already dragged her through the mud. Now it was her turn to rise out of it and burn the path behind her. The courthouse loomed like a cathedral of judgment, all concrete and solemn symmetry. The sky overhead was the color of old bruises, and the wind carried the faint scent of wet asphalt and tension. Elena stepped out of the cab with a manila folder tucked beneath her arm, a navy blazer borrowed from a friend, and the quiet steel of someone who had already been broken and survived it. Inside the hall buzzed with low murmurs. Reporters lingered by the stairwells. Phones buzzed. Eyes followed her as she walked. She didn't meet their gaze, not out of fear, but focus. Each step echoed off marble tile as if the walls were listening. Courtroom 4B, 10:00 a.m. sharp. She pushed the door open just as Harper's attorney was smoothing his tie and adjusting his cufflinks. Harper sat 2 rows up, hair-perfect, expression unreadable. She didn't look at Elena. The judge, a woman with salt and pepper curls and glasses that caught the courtroom lights like warning flares, entered without fanfare. She called the case with practiced clarity. Prescott versus Prescott, civil inquiry into allegations of defamation, forgery, and undue influence. Harper's attorney rose first. A man in a sleek charcoal suit with a voice like velvet dipped in contempt. Your Honor. He began gesturing toward Elena without ever really looking at her. What we have here is not a case of fraud or corporate manipulation. This is a family matter twisted by jealousy. My client, Ms. Harper Prescott, is the rightful heir lawfully named. What the defendant cannot accept is simple. Her sister earned what she did not. And now, with access to dated therapy records and unverified recordings, she seeks to defame and destroy. He paced slowly, turning toward the judge with a practiced sigh. She is quite simply a woman scorned, grasping for legacy she never built. Elena didn't flinch. When he finished, the judge turned to her. Ms. Prescott. Elena, do you have a response? She stood slowly, unfolded the manila folder, and stepped forward. Her heels didn't click. They landed. I do. She set 3 documents on the evidence table, hands steady. The first is a verified digital timeline of email correspondence between Harper Prescott and a private attorney named Samuel Linton. The emails begin 2 months before my father's passing and continue until the morning of his final will's notarization. The judge lifted the folder, leafed through the papers. Each email printed with date-time server metadata intact. The second, Elena continued, is a forensic voice authentication report confirming the identity of both voices in this audio file. She clicked play on the court's audio system. A moment of static, then her father's voice, weak but distinct. Why does this one say Harper owns everything? And Harper's crisp and firm. Dad, you said you trust me. Just sign it. It's easier this way. Elena doesn't want the responsibility. The courtroom held its breath. When the audio clicked off, Elena placed another item on the table. And this is a care log, notarized, dated, and signed by 2 licensed nurses who attended to my father during the last 6 weeks of his life. I arranged every appointment. I managed his medication schedule. Harper visited him twice. One of those visits was the day he signed the will. He was on morphine. She paused, not for drama but for breath, for weight. Her case relies on painting me as unhinged, on dragging out a therapy file from nearly a decade ago and pretending it discredits everything that's happened since. But I didn't come here to argue over my mental health. I came here with proof. The judge looked up, her expression unreadable. Counsel, Harper's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. We request time to verify these documents independently. You may have it, the judge said. But in the meantime, I am ordering an immediate third-party forensic review of the audio file, email metadata, and care log entries. Until that review is complete, all asset transfers, company ownership shifts, and financial withdrawals made under the disputed will are to be frozen effective immediately. Gasps fluttered through the room. Harper turned, finally, her face a mask of disbelief. You can't. You will not speak unless addressed, the judge said without looking at her. Harper went pale. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously. Elena didn't move, didn't smile, just stared straight ahead. Because this wasn't vindication. Not yet. It was pause. It was accountability catching up to a story rewritten too many times. As the judge adjourned the hearing, Elena gathered her papers and walked out past the camera crews gathering in the hallway. A reporter reached for her elbow. Ms. Prescott, do you feel vindicated? She stopped, turned, looked him dead in the eye. I feel seen. Then she walked away. Outside, the sky had opened and a soft rain began to fall. Not a storm, just enough to cleanse the air. Elena raised her face to it. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't hiding. The courtroom door clicked shut behind her and the noise changed instantly. No longer the measured cadence of legal arguments, but a crush of voices, camera shutters and boots scraping across wet concrete. Elena stepped out into the floodlights of a dozen press outlets. It was mid-morning, but the flashbulbs made it feel like midnight. Ms. Prescott, do you have a comment on the court's decision? Is it true you were the sole caregiver during your father's decline? Will you be pressing criminal charges against your sister? She didn't respond. Not because she didn't know the answers, but because she knew they didn't care about the truth. Not really. They wanted headlines, reactions, a dramatic quote for the next breaking news banner. So she kept walking, chin up, eyes forward, through the loose phalanx of reporters. Her heels clicked against the sidewalk like punctuation. The text started on the ride back to the motel. Laura D. saw the coverage. Proud of you. That took guts. Miles from college, always knew you'd rise. Let me know if you need a drink or a lawyer. Uncle Ben wish your father could see you now. He'd be proud. She stared at the screen for a long time before replying to any of them. Then finally, a short line to Laura, thanks. I think I'm still catching up to what just happened. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, was that none of it felt like victory. The motel room was still there, still smelled like industrial detergent and rusted water pipes. She dropped her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the tiny bathroom mirror. This was what winning looked like. Not champagne, not celebration. Just quiet, cold, and deeply painfully alone. She hadn't spoken to her mother since the first article broke. Not after the courtroom hearing. Not after Harper's public statements began to disintegrate under the weight of real evidence. Her mother's silence had stretched from confusion into indifference, and finally into something worse, stubborn absence. Elena had hoped naively maybe that when the truth came out, the fracture would begin to close. That maybe her mother would call. Or even just text. A word. A breath. But her phone never lit up with her number. She was no longer the embarrassment, but she was still invisible. Late one afternoon, the quiet became too much. She left the motel and drove the long road north up past the winding highways where the trees were still bare from winter's memory, where the grass hadn't quite committed to spring. She didn't plan to go back to the house, but she did. The gates were open just slightly, like the estate couldn't decide whether it wanted to keep the world out or let it in. She parked a block away, pulling her coat tighter around her as she walked down the sidewalk lined with ghost memories. She passed the hydrangea bush she and her father had planted when she was 11. The brick path Harper had insisted be power washed for her graduation photos. The front steps where Elena had once scraped her knee crying quietly so no one would call her dramatic. She didn't climb them. She didn't even approach the door. She just stood across the street, heart knocking against her ribs like it wanted out, and stared at the second-floor window. The light was on. The curtains parted slightly. And there she was, her mother. Hair thinner now. Shoulders rounded in a housecoat that looked too large for her small frame. She was holding something, a book maybe, or a shawl. She looked down at the street like she'd sensed someone watching. Her eyes met Elena's. Just for a second, then her gaze moved past her. Past her! As if Elena wasn't there. As if her silhouette in the dusk was just another branch swaying in the breeze. She didn't call out. She didn't move. She just turned slowly and disappeared behind the curtain. Elena stood there a long time afterward, cold, settling into her bones like old grief. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She just whispered to no one, "I can win, but I'll never matter." That was the cruel twist of it all. Truth didn't fix broken mothers. Justice didn't stitch families back together. Sometimes the cost of being right was standing alone in the street while the people who were supposed to love you refused to open the door. She turned back toward the car. The walk felt longer going back. The wind had picked up. Her coat wasn't enough. But she didn't look back. Not once. It was a Tuesday when he showed up unannounced, uninvited, but unmistakably familiar. Elena had just returned from the grocery store, a single paper bag tucked against her hip. Its contents? Modest, instant coffee, a loaf of bread, 1 apple. The motel parking lot was mostly empty, save for an old silver Buick parked crooked across 2 spaces. She didn't think much of it until she reached her door and saw him leaning against the frame. "Miss Prescott," he asked, tipping his worn cap. It took her a second to recognize him. "Carl," she said, blinking. He straightened slightly, adjusting the buttons of his coat like a reflex. "Didn't think you'd remember me. You were my father's groundskeeper." He smiled faintly. "For 32 years. Though he only called me that when he was angry. Most of the time I was just Carl who gets things done." There was a beat of awkward silence. The air smelled faintly of dust and memory. "I'm not here for long," he said. "Just passing through town and figured I should give you something." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope yellowed at the edges, the flap sealed with an old piece of blue tape. It had her name on the front, in her father's handwriting. She froze. "He gave it to me 6 days before he passed," Carl said. "Told me to wait. Said you'd come looking eventually, or maybe you wouldn't, but that I'd know when the right time came. I didn't understand it then, but I do now." Her hands didn't move at first. Then slowly she took the envelope. "Where did he keep this?" Carl looked away, voice quiet. "Hidden. In the basement study drawer. Behind the old maintenance ledgers. Told no one." She nodded, a lump rising in her throat, but she didn't speak. Carl took off his cap. "He was a good man, Miss Elena, but he was a scared one too. I think he wanted to be brave for you in the end." And then like that, he turned and walked away. She stood at the door long after he'd left, fingers tight around the envelope. She didn't go inside right away. Instead, she sat on the concrete stoop outside her room, legs pulled in close, the traffic humming in the distance. When she finally peeled back the tape, the paper inside crinkled like dry leaves. There was only 1 page, folded in thirds. No date, no greeting, just the voice of a man who had run out of time and was finally ready to speak without interruption. "I should have told you this in person. I should have said it 100 times, but I didn't. I let the weight of silence crush you instead, and I hate myself for that. You deserved better than me, Elena. You deserved a father who stood up, who didn't let his wife push you out of rooms, who didn't let his first daughter turn you into a shadow. I knew what Harper was doing. I saw it even when I pretended I didn't. I let her rewrite the story because it was easier than confronting the truth. I let her charm distract me from your quiet integrity. And when you left, I told myself it was your choice, not mine. But I was wrong." Elena's vision blurred. She blinked, but the tears came anyway. "I kept your old stories. Everyone you ever left on the kitchen counter. I told people they were Harper's when they asked. And I am ashamed of that. Not because it was a lie, but because it was the kind of lie that erases someone beautiful. You have your mother's fire, but you carry something I never had the ability to endure silence and still create sound. That's what made you dangerous to this family. That's what made you necessary. I'm sorry for every door I didn't open for you. For every time I looked away when you were hurting, for every dollar I handed to Harper while you were scraping rent together, I knew. I just told myself I didn't. You once told me you felt invisible. I should have looked you in the eyes and said I see you, so I'm saying it now. I see you, and if you choose to walk away from all this, I'll understand. But if you choose to fight, then fight knowing I knew. And I was proud. She read it once, then twice. The third time she read it aloud, her voice cracking with the effort of keeping the world from crumbling. When she finished, she folded the paper back along its original creases, pressing them flat with shaking fingers. She didn't wipe her tears away. She let them fall freely openly. Not from grief this time, not from rage, but from the strange, unbearable freedom of finally hearing the words she'd spent a lifetime waiting for. I see you. They weren't magic. They didn't undo the years. They didn't bring back what was lost. But they stitched something together inside her. Slowly, quietly, surely. Elena sat there in the waning light letter clutched to her chest and let herself feel the weight of forgiveness, of a man who failed but tried in the end to find his way back to her. And for the first time since the storm began, she let herself exhale. The email was short. Just 8 words. I'm ready to talk. Name the place. E. She sent it to Isabel Thorne, the same investigative journalist from the Ledger, whose first exposé had cracked open Harper's polished veneer. Isabel had tried contacting Elena twice before both attempts ignored. Elena wasn't ready then. She'd still been figuring out where her own voice lived in a story that had long been told by others. But now, with the letter from her father folded in her coat pocket like armor, she wasn't afraid to speak. They met 2 days later at a converted warehouse downtown, now used as a recording studio for Unmute Isabel's widely followed podcast. The show was known for its brutal honesty and minimalist production, no music, no dramatic voiceovers, just truth delivered raw, one breath at a time. Elena sat across from Isabel in a soundproofed booth lit by a single desk lamp. She wore no makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a plain knot. There was no script, no publicist, no agenda but the truth. The mic was warm when she leaned into it, and she began. I'm Elena Prescott. I'm the second daughter of Douglas H. Prescott, founder of Prescott Industries. You've heard of my sister Harper. You've seen her face on magazine covers, on television, standing at podiums she built out of my father's silence. Pause. I wasn't going to speak. I thought anonymity was power, that staying quiet protected something sacred. But I realize now that silence is exactly what they counted on. The story unraveled in slow, steady layers. Elena spoke not like a victim, but like a historian, careful, measured, relentless. She recounted the emails, the forged signatures, the coercion, the lawsuit. But more than that, she recounted the years before the scandal. What it meant to grow up invisible. What it meant to be the daughter always expected to understand, to yield, to make room. She read pieces of her father's final letter on air, his admissions, his regrets, his words. I see you. Isabel didn't interrupt once. When the recording ended, the silence in the booth was deafening. Elena stood heart-thudding in her chest, not from nerves, but release. You good with publishing this, Raw? Isabel asked, unplugging her headset. Yes, Elena replied. If I've learned anything, it's that the story isn't really mine once it's spoken. It belongs to whoever needs it most. The podcast dropped the following Friday at 6:00 a.m. By 6:27, it had over 30,000 plays. By 7:42, The Forgotten Daughter was trending on Twitter. And by noon, the world cracked open. Harper's name was everywhere but no longer gilded in admiration. Headlines multiplied. The Prescott Legacy. Built on silencing blood. Harper Prescott's empire under fire. After sister breaks. Silence. What does justice look like for the invisible? But the real movement didn't come from the media. It came from the comments. From the women. Elena sat in bed, knees tucked under her, as the replies poured in beneath the podcast transcript. They were raw, unfinished, sometimes messy. But they were hers. They were real. My sister stole my scholarship, and my parents never knew. I've carried that pain for a decade. Thank you for saying it out loud. The second daughter is always the scapegoat. My brother forged my dad's will after he was diagnosed with dementia. You just gave me the courage to reopen the case. You made me feel less alone. There were hundreds, then thousands. Some told stories, others just wrote thank you, or me too. And something began to shift. This wasn't just about Harper anymore. This was about every woman who had been told to stay quiet for the sake of family. Every sibling buried under a golden child's shadow. Every daughter asked to make herself smaller so someone else could shine brighter. Elena hadn't set out to become a symbol. She didn't want fame or followers, but she couldn't deny the power blooming from her honesty. Later that week, a television anchor referred to her as the voice of the silenced. Elena winced at the phrase. She didn't want to speak for anyone. She just wanted to make sure none of them felt like they had to whisper anymore. That night in the quiet of her motel room, she opened a new document on her laptop. No title yet, no table of contents, just the first line. This is the story they never thought you'd tell. And beneath it, in a smaller font, almost like a secret passed between sisters. You're not alone anymore. Because she wasn't. Not really. Not anymore. The official announcement came on a rain-slicked morning tucked between headlines about a local election and a celebrity divorce. It wasn't bold-faced or flashy, just a quiet bombshell buried on page 4 of the state section. Attorney General's office finds evidence of will tampering in Prescott case. For the first time, it was no longer rumor. No longer Reddit theories or podcast speculation. It was fact. The language was clinical. After an extensive investigation, the Department of Justice has determined that Harper Ann Prescott knowingly exerted coercive influence over Douglas H. Prescott during a period in which he was deemed medically compromised and cognitively impaired. The resultant estate documents are deemed fraudulent. All transfers and transactions resulting from said documents are subject to reversal. Elena read it once, then again, and then she sat down in the middle of the motel room floor, cross-legged like a child, the article resting in her lap, her palms pressed flat against the carpet to feel something solid beneath her. It was over. The illusion was broken. Within hours, Harper's name was removed from the company's board. Her personal accounts were frozen. She was placed under a temporary custody order pending further charges related to financial manipulation and witness intimidation. The mansion she'd inherited seized, the title nullified, and the world that once revered her, it went silent. The same voices that had once applauded her ambition now turned their backs. Colleagues distanced themselves. Partnerships dissolved. Her lawyer quit without a press statement. Even their mother, who had remained conspicuously quiet through most of the ordeal, offered only a tight-lipped no comment to reporters swarming her gated community. But Elena didn't celebrate. She didn't drink champagne. She didn't even return the half-dozen messages from people asking if she'd be reclaiming her rightful place at Prescott Industries, because that place never felt rightful. It had always belonged to a version of her she'd been forced to abandon long ago. The daughter who tried to please, the woman who tried to stay quiet, the girl who sat outside boardrooms while her sister rewrote the rules. So when the firm's legal team contacted her formally, offering to reinstate her as the executor of the estate and majority shareholder, she declined. She did it in person. I appreciate the gesture, she said, sitting across from 3 executives in suits more expensive than her entire year's rent. But I don't want the company, or the money, or the name. They looked at each other confused. She continued. This was never about taking anything back. It was about stopping someone who never should have had it in the first place. Miss Prescott, one of them said carefully, you understand the magnitude of what you're walking away from. Yes. This company is a graveyard, she interrupted, and I have no intention of living among the dead. They didn't argue. How could they? She walked out of the boardroom with nothing in her hands and more power than she'd ever held. That night, Elena didn't go back to the motel. She didn't drive past the house with its drawn curtains and empty windows. Instead, she sat in a small, independent bookstore tucked between a pharmacy and a coffee shop, a place that still smelled like ink and ambition. She spoke to the owner, a kind woman named Nora, who wore cardigans with too many pockets and always remembered names. I want to write something, Elena said. But not about Prescott. Not about the scandal. About survival. About women who disappear in their own families and somehow manage to resurrect themselves. Nora simply nodded. We'll save you a shelf. The next morning, Elena started writing. No lawyer beside her. No board minutes. No press waiting outside the door. Just words. Her own. For once. She called the book Inheritance of Silence. It wasn't a revenge story. It was a resurrection. In the opening chapter, she wrote, I was never after the house, or the company, or the name. I was after the girl I left behind, the one who wrote stories no one read, the one who made herself smaller to keep the peace. I found her again under a stack of old letters in a motel with bad lighting and the voice I almost lost. And this time I'm not letting her go. She printed that sentence and pinned it above her desk. Not for the world, for herself. For the version of Elena who finally understood sometimes justice doesn't look like a courtroom win. Sometimes it looks like walking away with your name, your truth, and your voice intact. The lake was always quiet in the early morning. Elena sat on the porch of her small cabin, mug in hand, watching the fog roll across the water like it had somewhere to be. A loon called in the distance, low and mournful. The air smelled like pine and old rain, and for once she didn't feel the need to move, or speak, or prove anything. This place had no marble floors, no chandeliers, no legacy carved into its foundation, just wood and weather, and stillness. It had been 7 months since the court's ruling, 4 since she declined the inheritance, and just over 3 since she'd moved to the lakeside town with nothing but 2 suitcases and a half-finished manuscript. Now that manuscript was a book, The Second Daughter and Why That Was My Gift. It wasn't an exposé, it wasn't a memoir lined with venom. It was a reckoning, a conversation with herself, with the girl she had been, and with every woman who had been made to feel like a placeholder in their own life. She wrote it at the kitchen table, usually in the late hours of night when the air was still and the silence didn't feel like a punishment. The writing wasn't linear. Some nights she wrote about the hollow ache of invisibility. Other nights she wrote about the small, defiant moments, the stolen pen, the secret journal, the way she used to leave post-it notes on her bedroom mirror that said "You matter even if no one says it." The book was picked up by a small but fearless publishing house that believed in stories without happy endings, only true ones. It was released quietly. No book tour, no press blitz. Just a cover, a black and white photo of a little girl standing slightly behind her older sister, eyes turned toward the camera, unsmiling but fierce. The response was louder than she ever imagined. Within 3 weeks, The Second Daughter became a cultural undercurrent. It wasn't just read, it was echoed. Social media lit up with underlined passages and dog-eared corners. Book clubs hosted late-night discussions over wine and tears. Hashtags like "Had Seen at Last," "Second But Whole," and "I Was Her Too" trended in waves. She received letters. Hundreds. Women wrote about the ways they'd been forgotten, overlooked, sacrificed. They wrote about brothers who inherited everything, about mothers who chose favorites, about rooms they'd tiptoed through for decades waiting to be acknowledged. One woman wrote, "I thought I was just bitter. Turns out I was just buried. Thank you for digging me out." Another, "Your book sat on my chest for 3 nights before I could open it. When I did, I cried on every page. Not because it hurt, but because I finally knew it wasn't my fault." But it wasn't the praise that anchored Elena. It was the sense of alignment. For the first time, her voice hadn't been twisted by someone else's interpretation. She hadn't written to win approval. She'd written to survive. And now she wanted to help others do the same. That was how the workshop began. Once a week, inside a repurposed library just off Main Street, she met with a group of women who carried their stories like wounds stitched under their skin. They came with notebooks, not sure what they wanted to write, only that they needed to. The first day, she handed each of them a blank page and said, "Write the version of yourself no one in your family ever met." There was silence at first. Then one woman began to cry. Another started writing. By week 3, they didn't ask for prompts. They showed up with poetry and letters to mothers who never said they were proud, with fictionalized versions of their worst days, with dialogue they wished they'd had the courage to say out loud, with scenes of love they'd never been given. And Elena, she sat with them, listened, sometimes guided. Mostly she just held the space open. She didn't claim to be healed. She didn't offer formulas. But she had learned one thing, that when you put pain on a page, it can't hide anymore. It loses its shape. And sometimes if you're brave enough to keep writing, it becomes something else. A tool. A seed. A story that doesn't end where it used to. One evening after class, a teenage girl with ink-stained hands and a crooked braid stayed behind. "Do you think I'm too young to write about things that still hurt?" she asked. Elena looked at her and smiled. "I think writing is the only place where hurting doesn't make you weak. It just makes you honest." The girl nodded, eyes wide. "I'm going to finish my story next week." Elena nodded. "I'll be here." That night, walking home along the gravel road that curved toward the lake, Elena breathed in the dusk. The sky was bruised with lavender. The water glimmered like a mirror with secrets. She stopped by the edge, crouched, and traced her finger across the surface. Ripples danced outward, gentle, steady. Once her whole life had been about inheritance, who deserved what, who lost what, who was seen. Now she understood. The only thing worth claiming was her voice, and she wasn't giving it up again. The call came just after midnight. Elena had been rereading a chapter draft, one hand wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, when the screen lit up with a number she hadn't seen in over a year. Her first instinct was to let it ring out, let it vanish into voicemail like so many unanswered calls from her own past had done. But something in her chest shifted. She answered. The voice on the other end was brittle, measured. A woman trying not to cry. Miss Prescott, the nurse said. This is St. Lillian's Hospital. Your mother asked us to call you. She's asked for you. Elena didn't speak for several seconds. She stared out the window at the moonlit lake, breath slowing. Is it serious? She asked, though she already knew the answer. She's in palliative care, the nurse replied softly. Late-stage liver failure. It won't be long. Elena closed her eyes. I'll come. The drive was fogged in memory and unresolved noise. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and faded hope. The walls were too white, the halls too quiet. She hadn't seen her mother since the trial. There'd been no letters, no apology, just silence. But when she stepped into room 209, the woman in the bed didn't look like the one from her childhood. The once regal posture had collapsed into the sheets. Her silver hair was limp, her wrists frail as candle wax. And yet her eyes, the same icy blue Elena had inherited, lifted the moment the door creaked open. Elena, her mother, whispered. Not a greeting, not a question. A recognition. A gasp. Elena moved to the side of the bed slowly, cautiously, as if the space between them were still made of glass. Her mother reached for her. Elena hesitated, but then finally she took the outstretched hand. The skin was papery and cold. I didn't think you'd come, her mother said, voice like dry leaves. I wasn't sure I would. A flicker of pain crossed the older woman's face, but she nodded. Accepted it. That's fair. They sat in silence for several minutes. The beeping of machines filled the void. Then her mother spoke again. I read your book. Elena looked up. Her mother's voice cracked. I read every page. Twice. The whole time I kept thinking, God, she was there the whole time. And I never saw her. Tears welled at the edges of her eyes, but didn't fall yet. I loved your sister, she continued, staring at the ceiling now. I still do. But I only knew how to love one person at a time. That's the truth. It's not noble, it's not right, but it's honest. She turned her face to Elena. You were always the easier one to ignore. The quieter one. The one who didn't demand anything from me, so I gave you nothing. Elena swallowed hard, her jaw tight. I blamed you when your father started drifting from Harper. I thought you poisoned him against her. I didn't want to believe he'd started seeing the truth on his own. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled. I'm sorry, Elena. Elena stared at her, at this fragile, failing body that once loomed so large in her life. The apology wasn't elegant, it wasn't cinematic. But it was real, and more importantly, it was late. Elena's voice trembled when she spoke. You don't deserve my forgiveness. Her mother's face fell, the breath hitching in her chest. But I'm going to give it to you anyway, Elena continued, because I deserve peace. I deserve to walk out of this room and not carry you inside me like a weight anymore. A single tear slipped down her mother's cheek. I don't want to die knowing you hate me, she whispered. I don't hate you, Elena said softly. That would mean I still needed you to be someone else. I don't. I just needed to be seen, and now you've finally done that. Her mother closed her eyes, her lips trembling. Elena? Shh, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's temple. Just rest. I'm here. And in that moment, the past didn't disappear. But it didn't rule her anymore. She was no longer the daughter begging for a glance, for a word, for proof she existed in her mother's eyes. She was a woman. Whole. Seen. Forgiven not because the past had earned it, but because she was finally free to give it. On her own terms. She sat with her mother through the night. And when the machines eventually went still and the dawn crept in through the hospital blinds, Elena didn't cry for the years lost. She cried for the girl who had finally laid them to rest. The invitation arrived in a pale gray envelope, embossed with the simple red logo TEDx Geneva. Elena opened it slowly, already knowing what it would say. She'd been approached before smaller events, book panels, literary talks. She'd always declined. But this felt different. This wasn't a panel. It was a platform. A podium she hadn't asked for, but now felt prepared to stand at. The theme was Voices That Rewrite. Her name was slotted beside economists, scientists, climate researchers. And yet when the event was announced online, it was her segment that drew the most engagement. The comment section flooded with one question repeated in 100 different ways. Is she going to tell that story? Elena didn't reply, but she knew the answer. Not just the Prescott story. Hers. On the day of the talk, the auditorium hummed with quiet reverence. The lights dimmed as she stepped onto the red dot. She wore no heels, no flashy outfit, just a simple navy jumpsuit, and her father's old watch on her wrist, the leather worn smooth from years of silence. She looked out at the sea of faces and began. When I was a child, she said I thought being invisible meant safety. If they didn't see me, they couldn't judge me. If they didn't see me, they couldn't expect anything. If they didn't see me, they couldn't be disappointed. A pause. But what I learned is that invisibility is a slow death. Not of the body, but of the soul, of the voice, of the self. She talked about Harper. Not by name, not with bitterness, just as a symbol of how systems elevate the loudest, the boldest, the golden, while others learn to shrink. I was the second daughter. The backup. The afterthought. Until I realized I didn't need permission to exist. I didn't need applause to speak, I just needed to write. The audience was silent. You see, some of us weren't born to be noticed. We were born to notice everything, to carry stories, to hold space. And when the time comes, we are the ones who rebuild truth from the ashes. At the end of the talk, she paused, then said simply, some people are born to be forgotten, until they stand up and write themselves back into the world. The standing ovation was immediate and long. Weeks after the TEDx talk aired, Elena's book was adopted as part of the official English literature curriculum at over 50 schools across the country. University professors cited it in syllabi under units like contemporary memoir narrative justice and the new feminist voice. But what moved Elena more than the academics were the classrooms. Teen girls in Iowa wrote essays about their older siblings overshadowing them. College students in Johannesburg discussed the ethics of inheritance and emotional neglect. A public high school in Queens staged a reading of the chapter, The Room I Never Entered. And then there were the letters. A boy in Norway wrote, I didn't think I could relate to a story about sisters, but your words made me call my mother. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. A woman in India wrote, my daughter read your book. Then she gave it to me. We talked for the first time about what I did wrong. A girl in Kentucky simply said, I finally believe I deserve to be seen. That was when Elena understood the story had outgrown her. It had become something else entirely, a spark in someone else's dark, a roadmap out of silence. And what of Harper? No one really knew. Some said she moved to a coastal town in Europe, changed her name, worked in a gallery. Others claimed she lived in seclusion, surviving off what remained untouched by the courts. Her face disappeared from headlines, her name from the glossy pages that once adored her. But Elena didn't think of her often, not out of hatred, but because she no longer defined her. Harper was a chapter, and Elena had written volumes since. She kept a photo in her office, a grainy snapshot of herself at 10 years old, crouched beside a library shelf cradling a notebook. She'd taped a quote beneath it in her own handwriting. I was never lost, just waiting for the courage to be found. One afternoon, she sat at her desk, beside the window light pouring in across the oak floor, and looked out at the lake. A student essay rested beside her, filled with crossed-out lines and aching truths. She picked up her pen and began again. Elena didn't need applause anymore. Not the standing ovations, not the flood of emails, not even the shelves that now carried her book across countries and languages. The world had finally listened, but it was the silence that followed that became her most treasured reward. It was in that silence, in the spaces between milestones, that she found herself again. Not as the girl they forgot, not as the sister who told, just Elena, a woman who had stopped running toward validation and instead walked toward peace. That summer, the lake town became more than a refuge. It became home. Her porch grew wild with ivy. The bookstore started stocking her students' self-published zines. The old rotary phone in her cabin rang less and less with business calls and more with slow conversations, people who didn't need anything but her presence. One afternoon, a journalist from a major outlet called asking for an interview. The second daughter turns 1 this fall. Want to reflect on what it all means now? Elena smiled softly. It means I'm done explaining myself. She politely declined, because there was nothing left to say, nothing left to prove. She now taught 2 workshops a week, one on memoir, one on voice. But the one that filled her cabin with light, with laughter, with release was a free circle she called the room with no mirrors. Women came not to critique their sentences, but to tell truths aloud for the first time. One by one, they took the center seat, breathed in, and began. There were no grades, no applause, just nods, tears, quiet affirming silence. And that Elena believed was how change really began. Not in courtrooms, not in headlines, but in rooms where pain could exhale, in spaces where someone finally said that happened to me too. Occasionally, she still thought of her father, not with longing or anger, but with a softened grief. She would reread his letter on colder nights. The ink faded just slightly from the way her fingers kept folding it open. "You carry something I never had," he had written. Yes, she did. She carried resilience without bitterness, fire without destruction, voice without volume. He had seen her at the end. And somehow that was enough. The university invited her once to give a commencement speech. The same school that had once overlooked her, that once poured endowments into Harper's honorary doctorate. She accepted. She stood on that massive stage beneath the graduation banners and looked out at a sea of caps and robes, parents with tear-streaked cheeks, professors in velvet gowns. When the microphone clicked on, she began without notes. There's a lie we're told somewhere between childhood and this stage, that your worth is measured by how early you're noticed, by how many eyes are on you, by how fast you rise. She let the silence hold. But I want to say something to the quiet ones, the ones who never raised their hand, the ones who were asked to understand too much too soon, the ones who got good at disappearing. She took a breath. You don't have to win the world's attention to matter. You just have to know how to write your name in your own story and not let anyone erase it again. When she finished, the graduates rose, not in chaos, not in noise, in reverence, because they understood she wasn't giving them permission to succeed. She was giving them permission to begin again. The final scene came not with grandeur, but with grace. On her 40th birthday, Elena walked alone down to the edge of the lake. The air was sharp with pine. The surface of the water shimmered in pale morning light. She carried with her a small wooden box, the kind her father once kept coins in. She opened it slowly. Inside were 5 folded pages, letters, each one from a different part of her past. One from her childhood diary scribbled in pencil, one from college unsent, one from the night she left the family home, one from the hospital after her mother's passing, and one from the night she decided not to inherit anything but her voice. She unfolded each letter, read them aloud, and then one by one she let the wind take them. They danced into the water like paper birds, fragile, floating free. She smiled, not the smile of someone who had triumphed, the smile of someone who had made peace with the fact that she didn't have to. The sun rose higher. A loon cried out across the water. Elena turned back toward the cabin. A new page waited on her desk. And this time she wasn't writing for healing. She was writing from it. Under the soft golden hush of a late September afternoon, Elena sat by the lake's edge, her knees drawn up, a worn leather journal balanced across her thighs. The world had slowed. No more deadlines, no more noise, no more audience to answer to. Only the breeze, the shifting sunlight filtering through the trees, and the faint rustle of pine needles overhead. A few pages from her latest manuscript fluttered loose from a clip and took flight, skipping like pale-winged birds across the surface of the water before sinking quietly beneath its glassy skin. She didn't chase them. She watched them go, a half smile pulling gently at her mouth. Her hands, freckled and ink-stained, rested still. The same hands that had once trembled signing legal affidavits, once clenched under courtroom tables, once gripped hotel sheets during nights when the past screamed too loud to sleep. Now they were calm, anchored. Across the lake, the mountains sat stoic and eternal. Shadows crept slowly down their slopes like a gentle hush covering the world. Inside the cabin behind her, the kettle had stopped whistling. A red pen lay uncapped beside the last sentence she'd written that morning. The stories we don't tell become the silence we inherit. She hadn't known where it came from. It had arrived whole landing softly in her mind before she could question it. She let it stay. Today was the final page. She opened the letter. Her father's letter one last time. The edges had curled from years of unfolding, refolding, pressing it against her heart like a benediction. She read the lines she'd memorized again and again. But today her eyes locked on one sentence near the bottom. A line she had skipped over for so long, almost afraid of its weight. I never said it out loud, but I read everything you wrote. Her throat closed around the air. A sharpness bloomed behind her ribs. It wasn't grief. Not exactly. It was something quieter, more sacred. Like walking through a house you'd grown up in and finding years later that your childhood drawings were still taped to the back of a closet door. She read the line again, letting the words wrap around her like warmth. He read everything, not just the early stories she had scribbled in lined notebooks and left by his chair, but the essays she thought no one cared about, the quiet poems folded beneath her pillow, the anger scrawled into letters never mailed. He saw it all, even if he never said so. And now here she was, still writing, but this time without needing to be seen. She looked up, eyes tracing the flight of a single leaf drifting down from a high branch. It spiraled lazily through the air before landing at her feet. A soft rustle like the page of a closing book. She reached down and picked it up, held it in her palm like a final punctuation. The wind moved again, gently brushing through her hair, lifting strands across her cheeks like a touch. She closed the journal, laid it flat beside her, then tilted her head toward the open sky and whispered, "I finished it, Dad. I've written it all." The lake answered only with silence. Not cold or distant, but reverent, soft, like it understood. Elena leaned back on her hands, legs outstretched, and breathed. For the first time in her life, she wasn't writing for a legacy. She wasn't writing to be heard. She wasn't writing to win. She had written to remember, to forgive, to stitch the ragged pieces of her story into something whole. And now that it was done, she could finally rest. The sun dipped low, casting amber light across the water, and her reflection shimmered in its depths, older, wiser, complete. The silence around her was no longer the kind she once feared. It was peace, and she wore it like armor, like grace.